Silence is often praised as a strength, a sign of maturity or restraint, or maybe even regulation. But what if silence is also avoidance? What if the very thing that calms your nervous system in one moment can become the thing that keeps you stuck in the next? In this episode, we're talking about the double-edged sword of silence, how it can be protective and regulating, or how it can become self-abandoning and even harmful. Welcome to the Building Resilience Podcast, episode 245, When Silence Helps and When It Hurts. Welcome to Building Resilience, a podcast where theory, practical strategies, and inspiring stories show you how to unlock your best life. I'm your host, Leah Davidson. As a certified life coach, speech-language pathologist, and nervous system resilience expert, it is my mission to teach you how to be more resilient to life's adversities. I will show you how to manage your mind, befriend your nervous system, process your emotions, and even eliminate stress. It's time to do more than just survive. It's time to thrive. Let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am so happy to have you here. Now, I want you to stop and pause and think about what your thoughts are on silence. Do you think of it as a wise thing to do? Or do you think of it as something avoidant? Silence, I think, can be very misunderstood, especially when we think of it in terms of the nervous system. And like most things, it really depends on context, intention, and nervous system state. So we are going to look at 5 different ways silence can impact your nervous system, both positively and negatively, and how to recognize when your silence is serving you versus when it's signaling dysregulation, shutdown, or disconnection. Let's get started. Firstly, let's talk about silence as a regulation tool. So your nervous system is always talking to you, but sometimes you have to decode what it is saying. Sometimes it is saying, thank you for not making me push past capacity, because sometimes silence is the most regulated choice. Maybe it is the nervous system saying, not everything needs to be explained, or we don't need to match that energy, or let's pause and wait for safety to return. So this is the kind of silence that can help you center yourself, bring yourself back to home instead of spinning into reactivity. So maybe you get an email, and instead of trying to quickly, rapidly fire a defensive response, you just move on and walk away. You take a break, you pause, you breathe. Or maybe you read the message, and instead of replying while your heart is pounding, you turn to your journal, or you do the safety sequence. So in this case, using silence is a tool to help you regulate, to help you stabilize, to help you come back home. It's as if you're saying, I'm not ignoring this, I'm tending to it internally first. When you deliberately choose silence, you are doing it from a more regulated state with the intention of anchoring in that zone of resilience. So it can be a very good reset. Silence then can create space for clarity, and it can create room for discernment. And most importantly, it puts you back in the driver's seat instead of letting survival mode completely take over. So the question to be asking yourself is, am I choosing silence because I'm connected to myself, or connecting to myself because I have my own back, or because I'm afraid of conflict, rejection, or discomfort? So now let's go to the flip side. Silence can also be your nervous system disappearing. For some of us, especially those of us who lean towards team hypo, silence may not be a tool, but can be a symptom. This is what can happen when your system gets overwhelmed or flooded, and then you may be inclined to shut down communication-wise. Maybe you feel like the words don't come, or even the thoughts slow down. Things can get foggy or numb, or you can even freeze. And this silence is not the same as the one that we just discussed earlier. This isn't about the pause of regulation. This is about shutdown, collapse, energy conservation. This is a symptom of team hypo. When I don't know how to say what I feel, or I don't even feel anything, or I don't have the energy to feel, or I don't care, or I don't feel that anyone else cares. So this kind of silence can feel protective in the moment, but if it continues, it can be really confusing because it's hard to tell, am I being wise and still and silent, or am I trying to be invisible because it feels safer? And this kind of silence often comes along with shame, because then we may beat ourselves up for not speaking up or not speaking up sooner. Or maybe we let the silence stretch on too long and then suddenly feel even less able to re-engage. Sometimes this type of silence may be rooted in trauma. Maybe for some in childhood, you may have learned that being quiet kept the peace. Or you may have learned that speaking brought punishment or misunderstanding. So you just stopped. You just stopped speaking. So that is a pattern that you continue. As you get older, even though the patterns are there, you may build some awareness and want to explore this kind of silence too. So you may want to ask yourself, is this silence serving who I am now or protecting the child I used to be? Now, the third kind or role of silence I want to talk about involves boundaries. Silence can actually be a boundary. It can be a way of honoring your capacity or a way of just opting out of conflict that's just not worth the cost, because there always is a cost. In my Nervous System Journaling Club, I created a nervous system cost calculator where you can see what the cost is for the stressors in the short term and the long term to your nervous system. Because silence as a boundary can be useful. As much as we talk about the importance of processing emotions, some emotions will just keep us spinning. They can actually just be patterns, patterned responses. They are indulgent emotions, meaning we feel them, but they may not be serving a purpose. For example, worry. It's a very common emotion, but it serves very little purpose. So not every emotion needs an audience, so to speak, and not every moment needs a response. And sometimes silence is totally having your own back. It can be like saying, I know what I feel. I don't need to explain it to be valid. Now, I always think of that saying, I'm not going to even dignify that with a response. Now, there can be a layer of defensiveness there, but it is true. Sometimes silence is the best response because there is no purpose to engage. But it can also get tricky here. We can sometimes start using silence as a form of control. So think about the silent treatment. This type of silence is not being used as a nervous system pause, but as a weapon. This silence can be used to punish, to manipulate, to make somebody guess what they did wrong. And it can be very subtle, but it exists. The difference between the two is that boundaries protect you and control tries to manage them. So here we want to pause and ask, is this silence creating more safety and alignment for me? Or am I using it to maintain power, superiority, or avoidance? Because if silence is creating distance but not clarity, it might not be a boundary, it might be a defense. And at this point, I want to stop and say, we likely use all forms of silence. So I don't want you to use this information against yourself. There will be times where we will use silence for us and we will use silence against us. We don't want to have any judgment. This is not about shaming or blaming. It's about building awareness as to how you use silence. Now let's move into the fourth silence that we're going to talk about. It's almost a quiet silence. It is the kind of silence after a big event or after going through something hard, maybe a diagnosis or a crisis. But essentially, it is after the moment where you had to hold it all together, then the quiet comes. And often with this silence, it's accompanied by grief, emotion, exhaustion, maybe even confusion. So sometimes silence isn't about not speaking. It's about giving yourself space to feel and to feel words. I think of myself. Recently, we have had a very heavy year with a lot going on for us. Health challenges, family challenges, work challenges, life challenges. And a couple of weeks ago, after a particularly good day, when something that was causing us a lot of anxiety had gone really well, and by all accounts was good news and should have been a sigh of relief, my husband and I went for a walk. And as we were walking and talking, I had this overwhelming urge to cry. As we talked, and I just cried. And we both shared how it was like a silent grief that we were having about so many of the things that we had been going through. And while it may seem surprising that it was coming after good news, it was kind of like we had been holding our breath Or we would start to breathe and something else would come up again. And this grief rolled in now because I think we actually were giving it space. So it's kind of like the drop that happens after the adrenaline wears off. I think it literally is like the nervous system exhaling. It was a moment that my body said, okay, now that we're not completely in survival mode, can we finally feel this? And grief can be pretty sneaky when it appears. Or as my husband says, grief is a sneakster. It doesn't always knock. Sometimes it just kind of seeps in through the cracks of silence, and it may take you by surprise. But when it happens like that, if you allow it, don't judge it, this silence can be very healing. Simply because you're not avoiding it, but because you're allowing it to integrate. And it's not about figuring out why you feel the way you do. I know I was trying to figure it out initially. Why now? Why the tears? I should be relieved. But as I started unpacking it, I realized there was a lot of different whys and a lot of different griefs. So I just stopped trying to figure it out and just allowed what was there to just exist without trying to justify or explain it. This is something that I'm going to have to continue to work with my nervous system on allowing things to move through without needing some tidy reason all wrapped up in a bow to justify. Lastly, silence can be a relational message, although not always a good one. Silence isn't just in your own internal world and whether you offer somebody silence or not. It can also be a message to others and a message from others. And I think it is a tool, if you want to call it that. In this regard, we do need to consider this kind of tool carefully. Because whether you mean it or not, silence speaks. And it speaks loudly. I think there's expressions like the silence was deafening or silence speaks volumes. For example, when somebody reaches out to you, whether it be emotionally or relationally or energetically, and you don't respond or you respond with silence, it is a message you are sending. And I think as a caring communicator, it is helpful to acknowledge that we all know that often silence gets translated into things like dismissal, indifference, rejection. Sometimes that is the message we want to send. Maybe it's passive aggressively because it's easier to deny silence than it is to deny what you said. Or even if you do not intend the message to land that way, often silence does land that way. I know I have felt this. I've reached out and been met with crickets, no response. And in today's world where we rely on technology so much, it is easy to simply deny the silence if you're ever called on it. So silence can really send you spiraling. Your nervous system can continue to spiral, and not because you need a solution or agreement, although sometimes you do, but because we all need acknowledgement. It's often better to outrightly disagree with somebody rather than ignore them. There's a difference between disagreement and dismissal. One says, I hear you, and the other says, nothing. And that nothing, it lands as sending a message of, you are invisible to me. So of course, it is important to protect your energy, to honor your own nervous system, but be honest and considerate in your communication. What is the cost of your silence? And who pays the cost of your silence? While we are all in charge of our own feelings and emotions, we are also in charge of how we treat other people. I always say I may be in charge of whether I am offended or hurt, but it is much easier to not be offended and hurt when someone else is treating you kindly. So sometimes even a one-word reply, noted, got it, thanks, is all it takes to keep somebody's nervous system from collapsing into shame or withdrawal. So overall, silence isn't neutral. It can regulate or it can rupture. Now, I want to leave you with two things or thoughts to consider or even journal about. I want you to explore a little bit more about silence. When does silence feel regulating for me? When does silence feel like avoidance, shutdown, or self-abandonment? Because silence is actually not just an absence of something. It can also be a presence, and your nervous system knows the difference and knows when it's being used for peace or protection. I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Building Resilience podcast. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about managing stress, building resilience, and leading a more purposeful life, then make sure we're connected on Instagram and Facebook at Leah Davidson Life Coaching. You can also subscribe to my weekly newsletter at www.leahdavidsonlifecoaching.com/newsletter. Looking forward to connecting.